Hey guys, so in this video we are going to talk a little bit about rediscovery. So let's get into it. What do I mean by rediscovery? Well, let me give you some context. So the other day I was watching my videos, as I do. As you may know by now, I watch a lot of videos and I read a lot of different newsletters and articles, things of that nature, basically, because I love programming. And there was this great, and this is, you may have heard about this. It's an exploit that has become very popular in recent time. It kind of exploded, and it's called a CSS keylogger. Now, the author, or one of the people who discovered this exploit, where basically, to put it for those of you who may not know about it, you see in CSS there is this, well, there's a selector system which allows you to target certain elements, and what's powerful about that is that you can actually use selectors that allow you to express that, hey, apply this class here or the style to say an input field of the type password that contains the letter A. And in theory, if you copy paste the entire alphabet or all of the characters that could possibly be in a text field, and you do something like set the background image of that element to something, because if you do that, you can actually trigger a network request, and then you can include information in that network request to some malicious system somewhere that stores that information. In theory, that would have made it possible for you to steal people's passwords just using CSS. Now, the author of this little idea, or the discoverer of this idea, who published this paper not that long ago, I actually think it was just an article or a Twitter post or something like that, mentioned that, of course, the issue here is that when you type, your HTML doesn't revalue the CSS selector, which means that you will get the first letter but not the following things. However, in React land, it's very popular for people to use because everything is tied into the value attribute on the element. In other words, you have to explicitly set the value attribute to the thing that your CSS selector is going to match against. Now, that doesn't happen in native HTML or like natively, but a lot of people do this when they use React. They use the state to set the value. And it used to be the case that you did this. Depending on your version of React, you might not still be doing that, but that's at least the exploit. Now, I thought this was a very interesting thought, so I played around with it a little bit, I made it work, and figured out some stuff about it. I thought this was a really interesting thing. But then I watched a video by one of the security experts that I follow, and he's a hacker, basically. And if you know my opinions about hackers, I try to gather as many people as I can that really know their stuff about hacking, because it's so tricky to figure out hacking on your own. Like I do it myself, sometimes professionally and sometimes just for a hobby, but I'm just an amateur and this guy is much better than me. So he stated something that was very interesting. He said that this CSS keylogger, this exploit, is actually not a recent thing. It's been basically rediscovered because it was posted by another security profile called Mario a lot of years, like many years ago. It was actually back in the days when I was first getting into programming and so forth. And I don't follow Mario anymore, but I used to. And basically, that's what I wanted to talk about, because the way that this person portrayed this rediscovering was that it was perhaps a great embarrassment for the person who has rediscovered it or popularized this term, CSS keylogger. And that's what I wanted to touch on a little bit, because it happened to me not that long ago. It was actually today that I got a very nice comment from someone on one of my videos. It's a video that I call The Power of Types, where I try to explain why I like type systems so much and why I think it's so powerful to have types when you work at really large scale. because, and I'll not bore you with exactly why that is, but the gist of it is that when you set an explicit type on something, you can declare rules for what it means, what that value means to your system. That means that if you have, say, a name, you can declare a bunch of rules and have a class that is called name or username, and now the rest of your code can trust that none of the rest of the code can ignore validation checking and security checks and all that stuff, because it's already taken care of. Because if you just use a primitive, you don't know what you're getting. It could be anything, and that's a big risk. So this person had stated that he found it fascinating that I had found the same thing, because he has been doing this for a long time as well, and he likes to use it the same way. And then other people started joining in, kind of saying that on multiple videos that, yeah, we're doing this as well, and we're doing this and that. And that's what made me think about this rediscovery thing, because I've been asked many times, like when I've had an idea and somebody tells me that, oh, somebody else has already done it. Some people, and as I said about this other YouTuber, said that it must have been very embarrassing for this person who rediscovered it, and he thought he was the first person to ever think about the CSS exploit. But I don't know, maybe it is, but I can only speak for myself. If I figure out independently from somebody else, on my own, something that some other genius person has already figured out ahead of me, maybe a long time ago, I don't feel that that's an embarrassment. I feel very proud. I really do, and it's happened a few times where I've tried to express in my own way how I thought about something, and it turns out that some other person who's really, some of them have been really famous, have already said this and thought about it. And I think that's very flattering, and I feel very proud that things turn out that way, because if you think about it, that means that I think, or rather I came to the same conclusion as somebody else that I respect. Most of the people when I've been told that, oh, you just said basically what this person already has discovered, and I go, wow, that's pretty cool. And some people think that's embarrassing, or feel, I don't know, they seem to feel that it's not valuable that you rediscover something somebody else has already done. I don't agree at all with that. I think that you should, if you're in that situation, you should be proud of yourself. And I want you to take it one further as well, because you see, one of the biggest truths that I've found when it comes to this whole idea of rediscovering and being completely unique and being complete, you see it all the time. You see people saying that, oh, this thing is just another version of that thing, or it's a magical thing that happens where people, when somebody popularizes something well enough and gets, like, a brand gets really strong, that means that anything that is mentally associated with or similar to that thing sometimes becomes a cheap copy. And I think it's an interesting phenomenon, because that's the way how all innovation goes forward. You discover something from your previous knowledge. And to me, it doesn't really make much difference between whether or not, you're the first to think of it. Because it doesn't matter if you're the first. There's the only thing that really matters is what you do with it. For me, if I discover the exact same thing that somebody else, I feel very proud that I was smart enough to figure out something that the same thing as somebody else. And the same thing goes for products, for anything. Just because if you have an idea, you want to run with it, just experiment and see where you can get it. Because if you think about it, in the scenario of the CSS selector system, the CSS selectors exploit, it is true that the fundamental thing that this new person discovered was that, oh yeah, if you used the CSS attribute that checks for well, basically the value if it contains a certain letter. And Mario, back in the day, many years ago, he said that that's an interesting thought process. But when Mario discovered it, React and this idea of re-rendering the whole page and explicitly setting the value on the input field, that wasn't around. It wasn't around at all, as far as I know. Which means that even though this is a rediscovery, the threat that this CSS exploit poses today is actually much higher than what it was when Mario discovered it. Do you see? So just because something is a rediscovery of something, that doesn't necessarily make it a bad thing. You should be proud. If you discover the same thing as somebody else without any input from anybody else, just pat yourself on the back and say, hey, cool, I have the same, like, you know, great minds think alike. So what I want you to take away from this is that if you think about rediscovery not as something bad, but rather as an opportunity for you to see if you can figure something out on top of what's already been discovered, it becomes a very different mindset and a very different dialogue. If you want a good example, the iPad. Microsoft was the first company of the big company. Apple wasn't even considering the iPad when Microsoft first released it. Their product never made it. But they had that concept long before Apple did. But Apple took those ideas, made it their own, and created something much more popular and much more powerful. And you can do the same thing. Have a great day.